Buried underneath the dirt of Chile's Atacama Desert are shiny little deposits of reddish-brown metal. 9 kilos of the stuff for every 1 ton of rock and sediment. It's an ancient metal which shingled the roofs of Roman emperors, plated the ship bottoms of the British Royal Navy, and now powers our entire world. Without it, we as a species would be stuck in time, unable to advance our civilization beyond a candlelit world of technological darkness. Copper brings light to our cities, power to our homes, and water through our walls. Its uses are vast and its supply is scarce. The history of mankind and his ability to harness energy, be it from fossil fuels, the wind, the sun, or the splitting of the atom, is in its early chapters. Our journey towards a new world of diverse, renewable, carbon-free, and sustainable power is both worthwhile and difficult. A long trek on a winding road with one massive bottleneck. Copper. If you're interested in understanding and learning more about this shiny metal, often referred to as Dr. Copper, then you are in the right place. As someone who is invested somewhat directly in copper, it seemed necessary to me to wrap my head around this resource. What is it? Why is it so special? What is it used for? How is it mined? Who has it? Who needs it? How much of it do we actually use? I wanted to know everything I could about this ever more important resource. The other thing I wanted to understand is why the red-brown metal is suddenly soaring to all-time high prices. Hello and welcome to the Margin of Sanity podcast. It's been a little longer than usual between episodes as I've been pretty busy writing. My last written piece kept me quite occupied. It was a long expose on the tensions between China and Taiwan and how they affect my TSMC position. I went into every conceivable aspect of the conflict, its history, and its effects on the world. I described various alliance structures, looked into Chinese coercion techniques, and even went into some of the defensive capabilities of Taiwan. That thing was a full-on, soup-to-nuts, beginning-to-end briefing, and it was for paid subscribers only. Today, I have a piece which was equally as intense to write, and this one's for everyone. Today, I want to talk about the most important mineral on Earth, in my mind anyway. Today is all about copper. We're going to dive way deep into the red metal, and by the end you will know way more about copper than you ever expected to, or maybe even than you ever wanted to. Before we jump in, just a quick reminder to drop a like, a comment, or a 5-star review if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. If you're one of the new Margin of Sanity YouTube subscribers, thank you for joining. I'm going to work on a few more video pieces very soon, because I do see you guys. Also, just to note, this write-up comes with a bunch of really cool interactive charts and maps that I've concocted. Those are available on the written version of this podcast. All of that is available totally free on the Margin of Sanity Substack. All right, copper. Let's dive in. Part 1, Dr. Copper. Why Dr. Copper? Well, copper is an integral part of so many facets of our economy. Building, manufacturing, electronics, and infrastructure, that copper demand can serve as a sort of thermometer for how the overall economy is doing. Lots of demand means things are getting pretty hot, and the same principle cuts the other way. Recently, some of the price hikes we've seen on copper may be somewhat more related to lack of supply and tariffs, so bear that in mind as we move forward. Still, copper is a unique metal with a few very special properties which make it quite useful for many different applications. Conductivity, durability, malleability, and corrosion resistance are some of the key characteristics that make this shiny metal a friend to modern civilization. Your plumber and your electrician rely equally on copper and its unique attributes to do their job. Appliances, transportation systems, energy infrastructure, and even large data centers all need copper to function. In the early industrial age, copper was used for everything from ship hulls to coins, from gutters to clocks. In a post-Edison world, however, copper's uses took on an entirely new importance. Today, Dr. Copper is needed by all nations, but produced in large quantities by only a few. As the electrification wave takes hold in the West and new economies rise in the East, the demand for this crucial metal only increases. Mitigated somewhat by reuse and recycling, copper's demand has begun to outweigh its supply, driving the price of this metal to all-time highs. Before we get to the maps and charts, let's step back a ways in time and look at copper's ever more important role in humanity's evolution. Part 2, a quote-unquote brief history of copper. Today, economists use copper demand to gauge industrial health, but archaeologists also use copper adoption to benchmark societal complexity of long-lost civilizations. In the early days, 9000 BCE, people saw copper nuggets in riverbeds and thought, ooh, shiny. And that was about it. Now, to be fair, these were Stone Age folks, and their copper refining process was basically just banging the ore into shapes with rocks. No melting, just smashing. Fast forward about 3,000 years, and some people, mostly near the Balkans, actually started melting the copper ore. This was pretty crucial, as it gave way to the lesser-known Chalcolithic Age, the Copper Stone Age, which led, of course, to the famous Bronze Age in about 3000 BC. Copper, plus a dash of tin, i.e. bronze, armed Mesopotamian armies and filled Egyptian tombs. The Romans called it Aes Cyperum, meaning cypress metal, which led to the Latin name cuprum, which in turn explains the atomic symbol in the periodic table, Cu. Fun stuff, I know. The Romans turned copper from a crude craft metal into a workhorse for an empire. By the 3rd century BCE, the Republic was striking the world's first mass-issued copper coins, and under Augustus, pioneered large-scale minting of copper and zinc. The earliest known industrial production of a true copper-zinc alloy. Brass. Imperial engineers then wove the metal into infrastructure. Bronze clamps held monumental stone blocks. Entire temple roofs, the pantheons included, were sheathed in shiny copper tiles. And bath complexes ran hot water through copper pipes and valves. That is the first documented instance of urban plumbing to use a corrosion-resistant, antimicrobial metal, copper, rather than just good old lead. At the same time, copper alloys gave Romans their iconic bronze doors, artillery fittings, cookware, and statues, all produced in foundries whose scale and technical sophistication would not be matched again until the early modern period. In short, Rome showcased nearly every major civil and military application of copper known to antiquity, setting templates, coinage, roofing, plumbing, architectural hardware, all still recognizable 2 millennia later. So let's see. They kill Caesar, then Pax Romana, then a few hundred years of expansion, Christian emperors of Rome, Rome falls to the barbarians, and then copper production goes a bit quiet for a while, until the 10th century, when parts of now Germany and Hungary start reopening old copper mines and using the metal to mint coins. Europe itself starts to sit back up, and copper mines are being built all over mainland Europe, Scandinavia, and England. Gunpowder comes onto the scene, and suddenly blasting becomes a new part of mining, boosting copper production along with it. In Asia, Japanese pits at Ashio and Sumitomo's forerunners shipped refined metal to China and Europe via the Dutch East India Company. By the 1600s, Sweden's Falun mine alone supplied an estimated 2/3 of Europe's copper, essentially funding the Swedish Empire. By the mid-1700s, copper had become a geopolitical weapon. Britain began coating the bottoms of their massive warships with copper, cloaking wooden holes in thin plates that repelled shipworm and marine weed, enabling the Royal Navy to outrun its rivals. Back on land, a man named Matthew Boulton used steam presses to crank out the chunky 1797 cartwheel penny, mass-producing pure copper coinage with an accuracy that astonished the era's counterfeiters. And then came the telegraph. Today, most of us are quite familiar with these things called wires, which transmit electricity, but they only really began to be a thing back in the mid-19th century. Samuel Morse strung the first telegraph line in 1844, and 22 years later, the transatlantic cable stitched continents together with several strands of drawn copper, and demand for the metal exploded. Spain's mines in South America, whose origins date back to the Incas, began churning the metal out like clockwork. Mining itself became more advanced to meet the needs of a new industrial era, and the newfound capacity to produce the metal set the stage for its next source of demand: electricity. The dawn of this new century would be illuminated not by sunlight, but by electric current. And so, with the birth of the light bulb came the advent of the electric grid. All over the world, copper wires transmitted electricity, this new and important force, from source to destination, lighting the homes of millions. A seemingly infinite array of developments took place from 1900 to today, so much so that I could spend the entire podcast simply discussing them. Washing machines, war machines, calculators, computers, satellites, the internet, smartphones, AI data centers, all these things, and so many more, made possible by the same metal the Romans used for roofing. And just like the Romans, we still use copper piping in our homes. So, as the birth of the middle class ignited an explosion in home building, yet another massive demand source for copper arose. Not a damn thing happens today without copper. It has found a permanent home in human civilization, and unlike gold or silver perhaps, copper pays the rent with its intrinsic utility, not just its shiny glint. Part 3. The workhorse metal. Why copper is awesome. Copper's many uses stem directly from its atomic characteristics. In other words, the very nature of this metal, this element of the universe, is special. There are 4 main properties that make copper so useful to us, besides its shine and shimmer. The first is its corrosion resistance. Copper, also called the eternal metal, does not rust away. Instead, if exposed to the elements for a long period of time, copper will eventually form a green patina. You've seen this patina before on the famous Statue of Liberty, an iron structure sheeted with copper plates. The simple fact that copper doesn't decay over time when exposed to moisture, think roofs, pipes, statues, coins, etc., earns it the name I mentioned earlier, the eternal metal. But resistance to rust wouldn't matter if copper was impossible to manipulate into various shapes and sizes. It's copper's malleability, ductility, and overall fatigue strength, which make it incredibly versatile in the many tasks it performs for humanity. Not only is the red metal quite bendable and shapeable, but it's also extremely ductile. Copper can be transformed into hair-thin wires that run for incredibly long stretches. Moreover, these copper wires can be wrapped, unwrapped, thrown, bent, stepped on, etc., and still remain in one piece. As a guitar player who's owned many cables, wires, over his life, I can attest that copper is a surprisingly resistant metal, considering how malleable it really is. Antimicrobial might sound like a pretty fancy term to use for a rock that's been pulled out of the ground, but believe it or not, copper is, in simple terms, inherently sanitary. Bacteria, fungi, and other microbes get pulverized by the copper ions, and so no organic life can really live or grow on copper, even after it oxidizes and gets that green patina. Copper's antimicrobial nature makes it particularly useful in plumbing, and has even earned copper a place on the door handles of hospitals. Last, but perhaps most important, is copper's incredible conductive capacity. Copper is second only to silver in this regard, but silver finds itself lacking in ductility. It's tough to make a good wire out of silver. Plus, it's way more expensive per pound. When humanity wants to send an electric current from point A to point B, it must use copper to do it. Whether we're talking about a laptop charger or giant power lines along the highway, it is copper wire, ultimately transmitting all electricity on Earth. Moreover, the components we ultimately plug into this electricity, smartphones, toasters, speakers, air conditioners, etc., need copper to function. Small copper wires are everywhere, inside everything from the walls in our houses to musical instruments to sex toys. Regardless of which technologies will power the world in 100 years, coal, solar, nuclear, etc., basic physics dictates it will almost certainly be copper transmitting that power. Moreover, copper is also a great conductor of heat, and this makes it ideal for HVAC units and heatsink for computers and data racks. Part 4. The who, the what, and the how much. Okay, so now we know the basic function of copper and what makes it so special. Let's take a look at where all this copper ultimately goes. Below, you'll see 2 charts, or maybe you can just imagine them if you're only listening. One depicting copper's end use in the US and the other across the globe. This should give you a rough idea of how much copper goes towards which sectors and industries. Here's a rough guide to the contents of each sector. Electrical and infrastructure, that's power utility gear, telecom, data cable, business electronics, motors, wiring devices. Then there's building and construction, building wire, plumbing tube, HVAC coils, and architectural sheet. Transportation, auto, rail, ship, aircraft, and EV copper. And industrial and consumer. That's factory machinery, valves, appliances, coins, utensils, miscellaneous consumer goods, stuff like that. In the US, if you're just listening, building and construction is the largest slice of the pie at 45%. Next is electrical and infrastructure at 22%. And then there's industrial and consumer at 17%, and transportation at 16%. Globally, the picture looks a little different. Across the globe, it's electrical and infrastructure that makes up the biggest slice of the pie at 47%. Then building and construction at 28%, and then industrial and consumer at 13%, and transportation at 12%. The difference in US copper end use versus the rest of the world can be accounted for by understanding 1. US homes are overall much larger and also simply use more copper. Asian homes often don't use copper piping. And 2, a ton of electronics and motor manufacturing is done overseas. Now that we have a broad view on copper's end use, I think we can get a bit more into specifics. For now, we can talk globally, before I break out the maps. Once again, I'm just going to plug going on to the Margin of Sanity Substack. It's totally free, and just checking out these charts. You can hover over stuff, and it's got all kinds of colors, and it's pretty cool. But I'll walk you through each of these one by one. First is construction and building wiring, and that's 17% global copper demand. Next, consumer electronics and appliances, also at 17%. Next is power distribution and grid infrastructure, 15.5%. Then comes plumbing and water systems, 11%. Automotive and electric vehicles, 11%. Industrial machinery and equipment, also 11%. Renewable energy, wind and solar at 5%. Telecommunication networks, 2.5%. Consumer and general brass products, so that's coins, locks, ammo cases, that's at 2%. Specialty valves and fittings, 1.7%. Thermal power generation, that's coal, gas, oil, 1%. Aerospace, 1%. Trains and rail, 1%. Data centers, 1%. Marine and desalination, also 1%. Medical equipment and scientific instruments at 0.8%. And nuclear power generation equipment at 0.5%. Now, just to remind you, that's not necessarily a depiction of where all the copper has been put in the past, but rather what we are putting copper towards today. So that's not to say that coal, natural gas plants take up more copper per gigawatt hour than a nuclear plant, but simply that perhaps we're just building as a world more coal and gas plants than we are nuclear plants. And we can actually take a look at the next graph. Here I've laid out copper's end-use examples, assuming about a $5 per pound copper price. So I just have a couple products here. So say you want to build a natural gas plant or a blender. I laid out basically how many pounds of copper you're going to need to do that and how much that'll cost in USD. I'll quickly run through it for you. For a Ninja blender, that's about a pound of copper. It's about $5, something like that. Apple MacBook Pro, 16-inch, it's about a pound of copper, and that's going to be $5. SpaceX Starlink satellite, that's 18 pounds of copper, $90. Traditional gas auto, so that's a gas car, that's going to be 50 pounds of copper, and that's going to cost you $250. Next up is EVs, and that's going to be about 4 times the amount of copper in price than a traditional gas auto. And then if we want to build a mid-sized 2-story house, about 2,400 square feet, that's going to take about 439 pounds of copper, and that's going to cost about $2,195. Maybe you want to build a 3-phase power line. That's just a traditional power line you see all over the U.S. For a 1-mile stretch of that 3-phase copper power line is going to be 22,000 pounds of copper. And that's going to cost $110,000. To build a 1 gigawatt natural gas plant, that's 2 million pounds of copper, and that's going to cost $10 million. A 1 gigawatt nuclear plant is 2.5 million pounds of copper, and that's going to cost 12.5 million USD. For a 1 gigawatt solar farm is going to be 9 million pounds of copper, and that's going to cost $45 million. And for a 1 gigawatt AI hyperscale data center, that's just about 60 million pounds of copper, and that's going to be just about $300 million in USD. Okay, so by now I think we have a somewhat clear view on where the copper demand comes from, at least in terms of industry and products. Now we can take a look at copper demand by nation, and more importantly, copper production by nation. Part 5, the where. Who needs it and who's got it? The first map I have here shows refined copper consumption by country in 2023. No surprise here, like basically every other raw material, China is currently consuming the most of it, as they've rapidly expanded their energy production capacity, as well as pumped trillions into housing and manufacturing. Copper has become a critical choke point for China. They need roughly 15.5 million metric tons of it annually. That is about 200 billion USD of copper. In second place is the United States, which consumed 1.8 million metric tons of copper in 2023. And in third place, Japan, with an even 1 million metric tons of copper. Next, we have India and Germany, each which consume about 900,000 metric tons, and South Korea on its own in fifth place, with 600,000 metric tons of copper consumed in 2023. And finally, Russia and Brazil each consumed 300,000 metric tons of refined copper in 2023. Next, we can look at where all this copper is coming from. The second map depicts world copper mine production by country in 2024. And here is where things start to get a little interesting. Because, as I mentioned before, the US, China, and Japan consume the most copper. But the majority of the world's copper is produced in 3 countries: Chile, Peru, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Chile produces 5.3 million metric tons a year, Peru 2.6 million, and the DRC 3.3 million metric tons. Now, China and the US do produce some of their own copper. China produced 1.8 million metric tons in 2024, and the US produced 1.1 million metric tons. Russia, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Australia, and Indonesia also produce a noteworthy amount of copper every year. Indonesia produces 1.1 million metric tons, Mexico only 700,000, Kazakhstan tied with Mexico for about 740,000 metric tons. Russia produces 930 metric tons per year. And Australia produces 800,000 metric tons per year. Now, on the copper mine production map, I've also included the primary country of export for each of the producers. And you notice something. China is where the majority of the world's copper mine production ends up going. The US consumes not too much more than it produces every year, but China has a huge gap. The story in general should be fairly clear by now: how very concentrated both copper demand and production is across the world. Chile, Peru, and the DRC collectively produce about half of global copper. Moreover, China doesn't produce nearly as much as it consumes, and neither does India for that matter. Instead, large nations like these must import one of their most critical resources. In the next chart, you'll notice something. This chart is global copper production versus consumption in kilotons. And if you could look at the chart, what you would see is that the world's copper usage, meaning consumption, is a good bit higher than its production. How can the world consume about 4 million tons more copper than it produces? Part 6. Recycling. One of copper's most incredible properties that I didn't mention earlier has to do with its ability to be used and reused over and over and over again. Copper, thank God, doesn't rust away or lose its conductive abilities. Unlike steel, which does weaken somewhat with reuse, copper can theoretically be recycled indefinitely. When copper is refined from rock form into a usable sheet of metal, it is called a cathode. And a recycled cathode is just as good as a virgin one, so long as the recycling process was done correctly and didn't introduce too many impurities. And so that roughly 4 million ton shortage in 2024 is just about equal to the amount of copper that was recycled that year, 4.5 million tons. So where is all this scrap coming from? Yet again, I have an awesome chart on the Margin of Sanity Substack, which shows you global scrap recycling sources. I'm not going to read all of this out to you, but instead I want to talk to you about something perhaps you can imagine. This pie chart that I have here is split basically in half, and the colors I chose were green and blue. There's a key difference between two types of recycled copper. Scrap copper is either new scrap or old scrap. New scrap refers to the extra copper, which is left over after some product, pipe, wire, etc. has been produced. This stuff is shipped right back to the refiner to be remelted into a usable cathode. Then there's old scrap, which is probably what you would imagine when you think of copper recycling. This is the stuff pulled from junkyards and demolition jobs and the like, and requires a good bit more care and attention on its way back into the system. Old scrap usually moves more or less in line with copper prices. Imagine if you suddenly got 25 cents back for your recycled bottle instead of 5 cents. Depending on who you are, you might immediately go around looking for more bottles, or simply go and try to capitalize on the price move. You may even go dumpster diving for some easy cash. Point only being that while bottle rebates are usually stable and set by the government, copper prices are nothing like that. The price of copper has more than doubled since 2020, and before that as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that copper can theoretically be used and reused over and over, and for new scrap that is absolutely true. You can melt, smash, form, reform, use, and repeat over and over indefinitely with a piece of copper. That said, when it comes to old scrap, aka end-of-life copper, about 40 to 50% of that is essentially lost each year, as in it's simply not economical to recover it. The rate varies depending on whether we're talking about building and construction or consumer electronics. It might be easy to pull a lot of copper out of a demolished building and make a great profit. If I wanted to try and get a half pound of copper out of an old laptop, on the other hand, it's maybe not such a worthwhile endeavor. Part 7. Basics of copper mining and production. Okay, I think it's time we get a little dirty and talk mining. Some of this will be just general mining concepts, and some will be copper specific. Firstly, let's talk type of mines. Open pit versus underground. Copper ore is extracted from the ground in two ways: open pit mining and underground mining. Open pit mines are large excavations on the surface, essentially giant pits, whereas underground mines involve tunneling below the surface to reach deeper ore bodies. In today's copper industry, open pit mining is way more common. The vast majority of copper comes from open pit operations. Roughly 80% is open pit versus 20% underground. Why so many open pits? Well, the choice of mining method mainly comes down to the deposit's depth, size, and economics. Open pit mining is usually favored when copper deposits are near the surface or spread over a large area. It's generally more cost-effective on a per-ton basis because you can use big trucks and shovels to move large volumes of ore and waste rock. This scalability and efficiency make open pits ideal for low-grade, bulk tonnage deposits. We'll talk grade in a little bit. By contrast, underground mining is chosen if copper ore is located deep below ground or in steep or complex geology where an open pit just isn't feasible. Underground methods are more labor and cost-intensive. You have to dig shafts, build tunnels, and bring ore up to the surface. So they're typically reserved for higher grade or deeper deposits. Underground mining is also generally considered more environmentally friendly. In short, open pits dominate because much of Earth's copper ore is just relatively near the surface and in large, low-grade ore bodies that can be effectively mined in bulk. Underground mines fill the niche of accessing ore that open pits can't reach. For example, when the deposit continues at depth below an open pit, or in areas where an open pit would require removing too much waste rock. Those massive mines in Chile and Peru, some are about 2.7 miles wide and 650 feet deep, those are all open pit mines. Ore grade. How much copper is in the rocks? When it comes to copper mining, the grade is usually expressed as a percentage. Most copper mines have a reserve grade of 1%, meaning for every 1 ton of rock in that mine, there is about 10 kilograms of copper. If you walked into the mine and took a shovelful of rocks and dirt, about 1% of that shovelful would theoretically be copper. There's another type of mining grade called head grade, which represents the amount of copper present in the ore that actually goes to the mill. I like to think of reserve grade as a sort of once-a-year blood pressure checkup at the doctor, and head grade as the reading you get from a smartwatch in real time. In other words, it could be a bit higher or lower than the reserve grade reading. Over a mine's life, head grades often decline as the highest grade sections are mined first. This is why mining companies keep an eye on ore grade trends. Declining grades can squeeze margins, unless offset by higher throughput or technological improvements. This took me a minute to get my head around, so I'm probably over-explaining it. But basically, before I go build a copper mine, I have to take a look at the rocks and see if there's enough copper in the rocks to make a profit when I mine it. Usually, this is about 1%. That's the reserve grade. Then I get my mine up and running and start shipping copper ore to the mill. I probably start off with the parts of my mine that have more copper in the rocks, i.e. a higher reserve grade. And then as the years pass, I start having to mine the shittier rocks, less copper in them. So this real-time shift in grade is being measured by the mill, and that's going to be my head grade. In the early days, it can be about 0.5% higher or lower than that reserve grade, but over time, it's common for head grades to decline to about 0.5% to 0.7% or so. I explained that to death, I know, because now we're going to get into recovery. Recovery. So we've gotten our rocks, and now we have to get the copper out of the rocks. The amount of copper we actually extract from those rocks is going to give us our recovery rate. Naturally, just because there is 10 kilos of copper in 1 ton of rock doesn't mean I'm actually going to get the whole 10 kilos. Probably more like 9 kilos, actually. Although, of course, it could be a bit higher if that head grade was higher. So it could be 10.5 kilos or 11 kilos, but usually it's less. The type of recovery method depends first on the type of ore, which is copper-bearing rock, that you have. There are basically 2 types, sulfide ore and oxide ore. And the practical difference between those two is whether the ore floats or not. So why is floatability important? Because the highest recovery rates for copper mining come from a process called flotation. Okay, so you got your big rocks, which contain some copper, and you want to start getting the copper out of the rocks. You might say, recovering it. With flotation, first you crush and grind the rocks into powder and mix it with water, a muddy soup called slurry. You add tiny amounts of soap-like chemicals called reagents or collector, frother, that make the copper-bearing bits act like they're kind of oily. Then you blow air through the soup. The copper-bearing bits stick to the bubbles and float to the top. The ordinary rock bits sink. You skim off the bubbly froth, and there is your copper concentrate, usually about 25 to 30% pure copper. What sank is the waste, called tailings. This is the essence of flotation, and it can provide yields, recovery rate of copper metal, anywhere from 80 to 90%. It usually involves some refining and tweaking by the mill operators to get the highest yields possible. To quickly clarify, this recovery rate refers to the amount of copper metal that was in those rocks being recovered. The concentrate is still only 25 to 30% copper metal, and that is what's being sold to the smelter. And remember, this only works if your ore is sulfide ore, because there is another type of ore, oxide ore, that doesn't float so good. Leaching. Leaching is the process used to recover copper from oxide ore. So the first step in leaching is the same as flotation: crush the rock. Next, you place that crushed rock in a big shallow pile called a heap on a sort of lined pad. Why a lined pad? Well, because you're about to dissolve the copper in a liquid and drain it into a sort of pond. Basically, you drip dilute sulfuric acid over the heap. The acid then dissolves the copper out of the rock, making a greenish liquid called pregnant leach solution, PLS. Then, you mix that liquid with a special organic copper grabber, solvent extraction. It pulls copper out of the PLS and leaves most impurities behind. Then, you strip the copper back into a small, clean, acidic solution. Finally, we have a process called electrowinning, or electrowining, I'm not sure. This process involves placing plates of metal into the copper-rich liquid and applying an electric current in order to extract the copper. Without going super deep into this, the basic idea is that this setup will attract the copper ions to the metal plate, which has a negative charge, forming a sheet of copper over a few days. This sheet of copper can be peeled off and sold as pure copper cathode. No smelter required. For what it's worth, electrowining, or winning, is a really cool process that I've heavily simplified, but it does require some pre-existing knowledge to fully wrap your head around. If you understand some basic chemistry and electrophysics, it's worth reading up on for fun. Anyway, back to leaching. While this leaching process for oxide ore doesn't produce as high a recovery yield as flotation for sulfide ore, it is a bit less capital intensive and obviously doesn't require a smelter. It's just a bit wasteful, honestly, so probably doesn't result in the greatest long-term mine economics. Roughly 80% of copper ore is sulfide ore and is recovered through flotation. The remaining roughly 20% is oxide ore that is recovered through leaching. If you're mining oxide ore and using leaching to refine it, then you're done when you ship those copper plates off to whoever bought them. If, however, you're using flotation, 80% of copper is recovered this way, then you're going to be selling to a smelter. Smelters. Remember that copper-rich goop that we scraped off the top of our bubbly flotation pool? Well, that copper concentrate will be sold to a smelter who will then turn it into a pure copper sheet, a cathode, that can be sold to, well, whoever needs copper. Let's first talk a bit about smelting, so we can better understand how business is done between miners and smelters. Upon arriving at the smelter, the copper concentrate, called filter cake, is quite wet. About 8 to 10% of the weight is pure moisture. The filter cake is first sampled and assayed, so both sides agree on what's in it. Copper grade, moisture, any gold and silver or impurities, usually arsenic. The damp powder is then dried and blended to suit the furnace. In the smelting furnace, think giant, very hot kiln, the sulfide concentrate melts with a bit of silica, flux. The iron in the feed bonds with the silica to make a glassy slag that's skimmed off. The sulfur burns to SO2, captured and turned into sulfuric acid in the acid plant. And then the copper collects in a molten layer called matte, which is usually about 60 to 70% pure copper. That matte is poured into a converter, where air or oxygen is blown through it to burn out the last of the sulfur and iron. What's left is called blister copper, about 98 to 99% pure. The blister copper is quickly fire refined for fine control of chemistry and cast into thick plates called anodes. Those anodes go to electrorefining, a process somewhat similar in theory to the electrowinning process used for oxide ore, minus the dissolving part. The result, finally, is a shiny salmon-colored cathode that is 99.99% copper. Meanwhile, tiny amounts of precious metals and other elements fall off the anodes as slimes, which are refined separately for gold, silver, selenium, tellurium, all quite valuable byproducts. Slag is recleaned to recover any trapped copper before disposal or sale, and the sulfuric acid made from the off-gas is often sold to nearby mines or fertilizer plants. Pretty efficient. The smelter then sells the cathodes to wire rod, tube, and sheet mills. Typically, the smelter will sell the copper cathodes at LME price, whatever the current copper price per pound is, plus a little premium. Okay, that's smelting. So let's talk smelter-miner contracts. Now that we understand smelting, let's talk about how business is actually done between miners and smelters. When a shipment of concentrate reaches a smelter, both sides test it to agree on how much copper it really contains. The smelter then pays the miner based on the market copper price, LME, for that period, times the agreed amount of copper in the shipment. From that, the smelter subtracts its processing fee, the cost to turn the concentrate into metal. If the concentrate also contains a bit of gold or silver, the miner gets a little extra credit. If it contains too much of a problem element, usually arsenic, there's going to be an extra deduction. Because testing and final pricing takes time, the smelter usually sends a large upfront payment when the shipment leaves or arrives, and then trues it up after the final numbers are known. Contracts also spell out practical things like who pays for shipping and when ownership changes hands. That's it. The value of the copper, plus the mining processing costs, plus or minus a few adjustments. And here is an example to help clarify. First, 10,000 tons of concentrate arrives at the smelter. It's 10% moisture, so 9,000 dry tons. Lab tests show 25% copper in the dry tons, which equals 2,250 tons of copper contained. Contracts usually pay for payable copper, most but not all of the contained metal. Say this deal pays 96.5% of contained copper. That is equal to 2,171 tons of payable copper. Let's say the LME, London Metal Exchange, has copper at $9,000 per ton. Gross value before fees is 2,171 tons of copper times $9,000, which equals $19,539,000. Then we adjust for processing fees, impurities, and precious metals. First, processing fees, usually a flat fee per ton, treatment charge, and a small fee per pound, refining charge. For the flat fee, treatment charge, let's assume $80 per ton as the fee. 9,000 tons times $80 equals a $720,000 fee. And then for the per pound fee, let's say 85 cents per pound. For reference, copper is selling for about $5.50 right now. Anyway, 2,171 tons is about 4.786 million pounds, and that equals a $406,800 fee. Okay, so the total processing fees for our 9,000 tons, which is worth $19,539,000, is equal to $1,126,800, about 5% of the total gross value of the copper. So net of all smelter fees, we have $18,412,200. Then let's add freight fees, which is, let's say, another $300,000, impurity fees, minus another $100,000, and credits from gold or silver byproducts, let's say plus $250,000. And you end up with about $18.26 million paid to the miner. The fees were still only about 5 or 6% of the payable metal value that was present in the concentrate. Not bad. So let's actually talk about these miners. Part 8. Big boys, the major copper miners. You know most copper is coming out of Chile, Peru, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That doesn't mean the miners are owned by those nations, or companies within those nations either. As you might imagine, miners don't usually discover copper underneath their headquarters. Most mines, in general, are built on someone else's land, and the mining company pays that owner, be it a company, an individual, or a government, a royalty on what the mine produces. All this to say that landowners and mine operators are rarely the same entity. Moreover, it's often the case that multiple mining companies share ownership of a given mine. So here I want to break down the actual miners a bit and give you a general overview of who controls the market. Below is a table displaying the largest 10 copper mining companies in the world, ranked by annual copper production. I've also included the market cap of each company as well as the percentage of revenue that actually comes from copper. These companies collectively control about half of all the copper production on Earth. First up, we have Freeport-McMoRan. Headquartered in the United States, 2024 copper production 1,900 kilotons. Market cap $62 billion. Then we have BHP, headquartered in Australia, 2024 production 1,865 kilotons. Market cap $134 billion. In third place, we have Codelco, which is Chilean, and their 2024 copper production was 1,329 kilotons. This is a state-owned enterprise. In fourth place, we have Zijin Mining, which is a Chinese firm. 2024 production was 1,070 kilotons, and their market cap is $73 billion. Next up is Southern Copper, headquartered in Mexico, with 974 kilotons, market cap $78 billion. Then we have Glencore, headquartered in Switzerland, 952 kilotons, $51 billion market cap. Then Anglo American from the UK with 773 kilotons, $24 billion market cap. Then KGHM, which is Polish, and they had 730 kilotons with a market cap of $5.8 billion. And then Antofagasta from the United Kingdom, 664 kilotons, $26 billion market cap. And finally, First Quantum Minerals from Canada, 431 kilotons, with a $14 billion market cap. If you want to go back and reference that chart, it's on the Substack. Go check it out. It's a good time. As I mentioned earlier, it's often the case that a copper mine is owned by multiple companies or governments. And so below, I've made you a map of the top 25 largest copper mines on the planet. The mines on this map represent half of global copper production. The rest is made up of about 150 to 200 mid-tier and smaller miners worldwide. I'll also mention that some of the mines are polymetallic. They produce more than just copper. But those mines produce so much copper that they've made the list. Feel free to check out the map, hover over the little dots, and you'll get a little bit of information on each individual mine. You're going to see who owns it. You're going to see how much they produce each year just out of that mine, and you'll even get a little blurb about the mine. If operations were suspended or restarting anytime soon. I see that Cobre Panama, which produces 330 tons per year, was suspended in late 2023, and it's unclear when they're going to restart. Part 9. Copper Today. Why the Spike in Price? If you hadn't noticed, copper prices have been soaring, especially since the US announced a 50% tariff on all copper imports. But even before that tariff, Dr. Copper was ripping upwards in price. So, what's going on? Well, the short version is simply that supply is tight, and a serious demand narrative is taking shape. Copper's rally starts with scarcity. Mines haven't added enough new supply, and the ore that feeds smelters has been tight. So the fees smelters charge, a good stress gauge, plunged. On top of that, a few big disruptions knocked out meaningful tonnage, while drought and power issues in parts of Africa made operations less reliable. With less metal around, visible inventories thinned and prices began climbing. And then the demand story took hold. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term electrification, but it's one of the major trends that seems like an unavoidable force pushing the price of copper upwards. EVs, for example, require about 4 times the copper needed to make a traditional auto. And moreover, they require a lot more power transmission infrastructure for viability. If we can't charge our EVs when we need to, why would we buy them? Moreover, we need new power infrastructure, grid, regardless of EVs and electrification. The world needs more power than ever before. Massive AI data centers and just general economic development doesn't mean less power. It means more. More energy generation, which requires copper. More energy transmission, also more copper. And more energy consumption, tough to consume electricity without copper. This shift to electrification doesn't require you to agree that climate change is an existential threat. I think that, but frankly, there's another idea I basically agree with wholeheartedly. We are wasting oil and coal. Fossil fuels aren't going anywhere anytime soon. We need them for all sorts of things, primarily feedstock, fertilizer, and concrete production. Transitioning to nuclear energy, for example, saves us from wasting precious fossil fuel resources on something as silly as electric light and transportation. We could, quote-unquote, easily provide that electricity from other sources. I won't go into a whole thing on grid stability right now, since I'm already on a tangent, but suffice it to say that the world is going to need more power in 50 years, not less. And it's going to need that power in more places as well. All of this requires copper, and more copper than before. If you scroll back to that table that shows how much copper is needed for various things, a mile of transmission, a nuclear plant, an iPhone, etc., you'll see that renewable energy and clean energy always ends up needing more copper per gigawatt than coal or gas-fired power plants. But we saw that coming, right? I mean, surely the US has copper mines about to break ground any day now, right? Wrong. One US copper mine is slated to come online in the next 5 years. One. Why so few? Well, in short, it's a pain in the ass. A large greenfield copper mine typically needs close to a decade, often longer, to move from discovery to commercial production. That clock is filled with baseline studies, complex permits across multiple agencies, community consultation, indigenous consent, water rights, power interconnects, and frequent legal challenges. Even after permits, designs get revised for tailing safety, water stewardship, and biodiversity standards, which adds years and capital. In short, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and it's an expensive marathon, by the way. Second, the geology and engineering are tougher than they used to be. Average ore grades have been drifting lower. Deposits are deeper and more remote, and strip ratios are higher. You have to move more rock for the same copper. That means more capex, longer construction schedules, and more things that can slip. Costs have also been sticky. Labor, steel, explosives, power, and long lead equipment are all inflated in price. Finally, where the copper is brings its own risks. A lot of future supply sits in jurisdictions with shifting taxes and royalties, currency controls, or periodic export restrictions. Power and water can be scarce or carbon intensive, and grids and droughts can curtail output. ESG expectations keep rising, and any misstep can halt a project midstream. That's why companies often favor brownfield expansions. debottlenecking, leaching add-ons, and mine life extensions over brand new mega projects. Recycling will grow and help, but it doesn't replace new mine supply at today's demand trajectory. Put together, these frictions explain why copper can surge for months while new supply remains years away. TLDR, we're short on copper. Part 10. Thoughts. Okay, look, I'm not an expert in minerals and mining, but I am invested in copper. I can't exactly tell you how, but suffice to say that my secret position, for paid subs only, is directly related to copper, at least for now. I know, very cryptic. For me, the important thing is to get my head around these terms and the story in general. Lots of folks will tell you how to invest in copper. You don't need me for that. I've had Southern Copper on my watch list for a while, since I am somewhat interested in this trend of U.S. reshoring its critical mineral supplies, of which copper is a big one. I personally believe that this is more bipartisan than some people think. After all, you can't do very much without access to copper. I never took that plunge into Southern Copper simply because analyzing mining companies is not my specialty, with the exception of coal, I guess, but hey, that's different. What mattered to me was understanding how all this works and trying to fully wrap my mind around why copper will be so crucial over the next decade or more. I needed to know why it was unlikely copper would get cheap and stay cheap. That's all I really cared about. My hope in writing this was to give you a strong base of information and understanding in the world of copper. Do with it what you will. Thanks for listening to the Margin of Sanity podcast. If you like this deep dive, please drop a like or a comment. Let me know you liked it, and I'll keep this stuff coming. I'm thinking about doing another one on nickel, so the feedback is really helpful for me. It's earnings season right now, and I should have a portfolio update coming soon. So far, so good this quarter. That's all for now, and I'll talk to you soon.